Okay, so thanks very much for everyone hanging around. I know it's been a long week and I know it's kind of late on a Friday, but I just really interested to hear people's views on the kind of work we've been doing in this principle about feedback being data and thinking about it. I'm sure for everyone who's kind of getting to the kind of December part of your semester or moving into January, you're already facing either a large marking pile or you're thinking about the marking that's coming down the line. And kind of just with this image, I just want to kind of get people to think about how they actually do their feedback process for assignments. That idea of each individual student would have maybe their assignment submitted, and you might use a software or you might use a Word document for each individual student to return your feedback on it, right? So you have this idea of each student gets one feedback sheet. And the problem that we've been working with for the past wee while is these issues that we see of individual feedback sheets. You might not see them yourself, but hopefully we're going to try to convince you that there are a couple of issues. And this is a way we can think about working with them. So the problem with these individual feedback sheets as a marker, moderator, or module lead, well, multiple documents are cumbersome to work with, right? If you're jumping between different screens and different forms and kind of different ideas, you're applying more cognitive load and it's taking away your time and effort from actually what you should be focusing on, which is the feedback, right? So less documents should, in theory, be better. Individual feedback sheets make it harder to moderate after marking and to check for consistency and completeness. What do I mean by that? It means that across all your different student assignments and all the feedback you're giving out for each student within an assignment, say you have a class of 100 students, it's actually quite hard to make sure that every student gets a complete feedback sheet. Having external in various places and being a program lead at Glasgow for many a while now, you find the odd feedback sheet where the student ID has been dropped off, or maybe you have something written to your feedback where it says, we're going to give you comments on X, Y, and Z, and some of those comments are missing on some students, but not all students. So you get a disparity in between kind of the different feedback the students are getting. Another issue is that the restricted or the individual feedback sheet restricts the layout of the feedback as it's predetermined before marking starts, right? Particularly if you're using Word documents or something like Turnitin, you're going to set up how your feedback's going to look and all the different comments you're giving to students, or where you're going to put all your different comments at the start of the marking process. And you can't rapidly edit that once you're halfway through. I'm sure many people have had that experience of getting halfway through a pile of marking and realizing there's a fairly obvious spelling mistake right in the middle, and while you're trying to comment on students' communication, you've got this glaring issue and there's nothing you can do about it. If the feedback sheet wasn't generated till after all the feedback's done, then you can try and resolve all those problems. And the final problem that we're going to try and address as well is that with individual feedback sheets, which you pass out to students and don't really store anywhere, right? It makes it harder for you to reflect on all the feedback you have given, unless you actually go to a lot of effort to try and get that feedback back and go into different places and store it in some fashion. So our question really been looking at is, could this whole process be more efficient? And really, to kind of set a goal very briefly, is just to make assignment feedback more effective for student development. Show them where the grades come from and how can they improve in their next assignment. And we want to do this by making the process of assignment feedback more efficient for staff. We think if we can make it more efficient for staff, then that will leave them more time to improve the feedback they're actually giving, right? So we're going to try and look at reducing the number of documents people are working with. We're going to try and improve the consistency across students in terms of their experience, in terms of getting the same style of feedback at least, or the same quantity of feedback that everyone else gets. And we're going to try and allow space for deeper reflection on feedback by markers to help develop future iterations of your teaching, right? All the feedback that you give a class year one helps you reflect on the teaching you do in year two, okay? And that's the idea we're working in here. So in short, making feedback processes more efficient for staff will increase effectiveness for students based on the benefits of efficiency. And simply, for simplicity, just to clarify here, feedback we refer to here, just for this talk, as being feed forward and feedback. So whichever way you want to term it. And one other point of clarification has come up when we're talking about this idea. Prior to submitting all our assignments, right, and normally at the start of the semester, actually, the marking criteria for all the assignments are made available to students, so they're always fully informed. We're not talking about changing the marking criteria halfway through an assignment or halfway through marking. We're simply changing how the feedback might look, right, how it's presented actually to the students and what additional things we might put into that feedback. And again, just for a bit of context, you might see some words on the slides. It looks like critical evaluation, knowledge and research, and academic communication. And that's just because those are kind of the areas we focus on at Glasgow. Sorry, and if I didn't say this at the start, we're from the University of Glasgow Psychology and Neuroscience. Hope that made some sense. So again, it being Friday and late in the day, really, if you get nothing else from this, our take-home message is essentially feedback is data. It's the data to you and it's the data to students. But what you can do with data, you can also do with feedback, right? The hard part is really just getting it in a usable format for you to be able to do something with it. And this is where our story begins. So in 2016, in the Psychology Neuroscience School, University of Glasgow, we redeveloped all our research methods teaching and brought in R instead of SPSS. SPSS was the standard taught in psychology for doing statistics and research methods teaching, and we flipped it around to focus on R, so everyone was looking at data skills and developing their data skills from day one when they come to Glasgow. After a while of doing that, we started to develop a process for generating the feedback for each individual student, where we went from a table that looks like this one at the top, right? And let me just explain this a little bit. So you'd have an individual row would be a subject, a participant, the task number, their feedback, and the code that they put in, right? So this student here wrote library tidyverse. The feedback was you've successfully done it. And then if you scroll down to line 12 here, this is another student. They've also written library tidyverse and they've got the same feedback, right? So we go from a table like this to start generating individual feedback sheets that look a bit like this. Student 1 on the left and student 2 on the right. So student 1 on the left, they've got their individual answer and their individual feedback at the top. So library tidyverse, and they got it right. And then they've got some generic feedback down the bottom. Individual 2, they haven't done the right code, so they've got different individual feedback, and they've got the generic feedback the same as the individual as student 1 on the other side. But the point being is that for many years we were using this in data skills, where from one feedback table we were able to create individual feedback sheets for all students and give them tailored feedback, but also include generic feedback that we'd seen after all the marking was done, right? And that's what we're trying to think about in terms of can you do this for other styles of assignments, essays and reports? This sort of thing works really well for coding and data skills, right? For coding and data skills, we're reading in code chunks. It all goes into a data table or a matrix anyway, and we're just using that to output all the individual feedback sheets, either as HTML or a Word or PDF, okay? And we're adding individual comments and we're adding generic comments. The generic comments written after we've seen all the feedback. And I should just kind of mention that this was developed through the assessor package that Dale Barr in our school wrote for analysing and kind of giving feedback on student assignments related to data skills. But yeah, we wanted to see, could we do this with essays, reports, critical reviews, dissertations, the more kind of written aspects that we teach students throughout the year. To be able to do it with reports and essays, though, we have a stumbling block in that you would need something like this, right? This table at the top, where you've got, again, each row is a kind of a student or a group, and then you've got the individual text that they're getting in their feedback as a cell in each individual row, and you can even have the grade on it. So this was our first initial iteration at this. We asked markers to write their feedback in Excel and generate feedback sheets based on the Excel. The same idea we're using with the data skills, and this was developed through a package called Marker, again in R, that Lisa De Bruyne and Helene and myself have also been developing. The main issue with this approach, however, whilst it's not uncommon, actually many schools, higher secondary education, would use a similar approach to this to write their kind of student reports throughout the year and then use some form of mail merge to generate it. So whilst not uncommon, the thing we found is that people actually hate using Excel as a word processor, and they just hate typing into Excel for many different reasons. So that was always a stumbling block for us. And after several more iterations, we eventually developed a process that would use Word and a combination of Word and R. Word is basically one of the most common software that academic staff will use, and it's going to allow us to add in kind of formatting and hyperlinks as well. It took a while to get there, but after a while, we realized that this sort of format up at the top works well for our team. It's really very basic. So at the top, you've got the marker, they write their name, and then they have a space along their Word document for each individual student and the feedback for each student, okay? So it'll be quite a long Word document depending on how many students you have, but there's a space for each individual student. More recently, we've actually started pre-populating the student ID, or the student identifier, so the staff don't have to worry about that. And the staff, again, just have to focus on writing any feedback. So the top bit here, our staff will just write one word, either like excellent, very good, and good, etc. And then down here, they might write more paragraphs of kind of feed forward comments, or they might write bullet points, etc. The actual structure of the Word document could really be whatever you want it to be. So if you've got a large rubric, you could have many inputs here that are just numbers, or you could have kind of any different written comments down at the bottom. Again, the key point is that you've really just got one Word document, and within that, each staff can write the feedback for every individual student. I should just clarify though, because I think that sounded a bit wrong in a way. Each staff will have their own Word document. It's kind of dubious about whether each staff should all write on the same Word document. I think that might cause a disaster, but each staff has their own individual Word document, and they write their individual comments for each student. Okay, so an example here is Helena's Word document, student ID, verbal descriptors, and then some text at the bottom, and again, next student, etc. We then read that into a table like this on the right hand side, and then from there we are basically back to where we were with the data skills. So we can now use this to start generating feedback sheets, because we've got all the text that we need in the one data table. What's really nice about once you've got it in a data table is you can really generate any feedback sheet you want, right? So these are two examples that we use at Glasgow, this one on the left and this one on the right. So this one uses kind of highlighting of the different verbal descriptors, and then text about the actual kind of criteria more focused on this. This one on the right uses just writing out the verbal descriptors, and then focusing on more what did you do well, what could be improved, and what's the actual feed forward for the next assignment. Again, so it's that idea of like, once you've actually got kind of the comments in the data table, you can really kind of manipulate the feedback sheet to however you think's best. And you can, again, as we said at the start, get rid of any of those issues you see in your feedback sheet. You can add additional support material like dealing with feedback and how to reflect on feedback. We all know that it can be quite an emotive experience for students. So for some of our feedback sheets, we've started adding in information about how to deal with actually receiving feedback and not just getting kind of quite emotive about it. So little bits that you start adding in. Another example might be we've started adding in details of our moderation procedures, which our students find quite informative. So it stops them thinking about each of the grades just being one person's opinion. But the point being that that sort of stuff can only be added in after, if the feedback sheets themselves are not generated until you've got all the feedback in, and you start to see what does the class actually need. So that's the main idea we've been doing. But a couple of other nice additions you can do on that once you have all the feedback within a data table is you can start to analyze the feedback in some fashion, okay? So for example, this figure on the left-hand side, we've got 6 markers, Dr. 1, Dr. 2, Dr. 3, 4, 5, 6. Along the bottom, you've got different grade bands, A, B, C, D, E, and G. And on the y-axis, we've looked at the total number of words per individual report, okay? Seems a bit of an odd thing to look at, but it is actually reasonably informative at times, because it can help you pick up things you might have missed if you're not doing any sort of analysis on your feedback. So it can look for things like consistency within a marker, right? So if I look at Dr. 1 here, you can see actually for the high A bands, they've got quite limited on their word usage, 25, 50 words. And then as they go down the grade scale, they get much more words going out towards the students. The different colors are the different kind of criteria we use. Again, down here in Dr. 4, really kind of spread out and more words again as you go lower down the feedback bands or the grade bands, whereas Dr. 5 is much more consistent across all the feedback bands. So humans aren't meant to be robots. Staff are not meant to be robots, but it helps us have a look at some of these ideas, and it helps us address one common issue people see in marking, which is that high bands tend to get very little feedback, and often it's things like keep it up, which isn't really that informative, and low bands tend to get lots and lots of feedback, which even though we think we're helping, can actually be quite off-putting for that student. So this is a sort of a snapshot way you can analyze the feedback that's in the data table to see what your staff are doing and to try and help iteratively staff develop their feedback to think about what they're doing. Another thing we can also look at is the number of comments per report and the number of words per comment. And I should say, sorry, this is for on-script comments. So perhaps you're using Word documents and you're going down the side and putting on-script comments. You can start to look at the number of comments people are putting on each assignment and the number of words within those individual comments. These two figures come from one assignment I looked at, which is one of our undergrad reports. So it's a quantitative report. It's about 150 students across 20 odd markers, I think it was. And I looked at basically the number of comments each marker was giving on each individual report. The maximum number of comments was 63 comments. So one student got 63 comments. The minimum number of comments varied from 0. So some students actually didn't get any comments to 1. Some students got 1 comment. And actually, when I looked at it in more detail, that comment might just be a question mark or something like that, or don't understand. So there's quite a large variation there. Again, if we look at the number of words per comment, maximum is 145, and the minimum, again, 0, 1. Sometimes people accidentally put out comments that have no words in them, and again, which can be quite confusing to the student, and it just kind of breaks down a sort of a relationship the staff and student are trying to create with the feedback process. So from this sort of analysis, what we've been able to do as a team is start thinking about things like setting an acceptable range for the number of comments, maybe 5 to 8 per student, right? So it means that staff are not going over the top in the number of comments, just firing on every single comment, and just again, some level of consistency across the students. So for example, maybe if you're doing a report that's got like an introduction, methods, results, discussion, abstract, you might have 1 comment per section. But these are things you can decide as a team. You can even decide if you're going to use on-script comments or not, which is actually really quite important. If half your students are not getting any comments and some of your students are, again, that creates a disparity. So being able to analyze the data you're putting out or the feedback you're putting out in this sort of fashion just helps you break down those kind of like feelings that it depends what marker you get, and kind of everyone's actually getting the same experience across the feedback process. And it's really about being more mindful of the comments, okay? And to kind of wrap up and to get to kind of the final point we're looking at, this is just a schematic we put together a while back for a blog we did. And it's kind of what is the feedback loop for a student perspective, right? So the lecturer sets an assignment, the student goes to the lecture series, gets the assignment, takes the assignment, fills it in, and then kind of gets some feedback on it, which we all like to use with a red pen. And then from that feedback, they're meant to develop some knowledge and skill and then go to the next lecture series. And it goes on and on and on. So that's the assessment feedback loop. But one thing, the process we are talking about where you actually store your feedback and analyze it and review it in some fashion allows us to do is restore this link that is lacking in a lot of the feedback processes that are currently in place. This is the link that says a lecturer should learn from their own feedback, right? So if you spend a long time writing all these comments to students and then just put it into a system that you have no control of or never look at again, then that's lost. It's lost to the ether. If, however, you store it in a data table and use it to reflect, to create generic feedback, either kind of before you release all the feedback, and then maybe again at the start of the next year and next semester to think about what were the common issues. Now you as a lecturer are using your own feedback to kind of improve your own practice and in your own teaching. And kind of being able to think of feedback as data helps restore this really important link that's actually going to improve iteratively the whole process, and effectively might actually reduce the amount of feedback you have to give students over the coming years. So it's again just thinking about that idea of feedback as data. And again, if that's the only really message you get from this, I'm happy with that. To a couple of concerns that people have raised with this process. Don't you need to be proficient at R? All the things we've done is basically a combination of R and some other software. R and Word is the latest one we're using. Do you need to be proficient? Yes and no. Right now, you would need someone in your team who's semi-decent at R, right? I wrote all the codes and I'm not the best R coder in the world. I'm semi-decent at R. Well, we're semi-decent at the bits of R that I need to be able to do. But I'm happy to share my codes and help anyone try to set this up if they want to try and do it on their own teams. Okay, so the codes will eventually be available on GitHub, but because I've just not had any time to actually anonymize some of the stuff and set it up in a generic way, they're just not publicly available yet, but I am more than happy to share my codes if anyone wants to try it. So yeah, you need someone right now who's semi-decent, but be quick to pick up what you need to actually be able to do. But we use Turnitin or some other software for feedback. I'm not going to start on kind of whether people should use X, Y, or Z software. I think everyone should kind of have their own approach to kind of their feedback for what works best for them. The only thing I would say, if you are using some software that doesn't allow you to store and think about your feedback, considering including approach that would allow you to think about analyzing and improving your own feedback in some fashion, okay, and not just sending it out to the students and forgetting about it. So really, conclusions on this. Designing feedback sheets after the feedback is written allows great flexibility, right? It allows us to add additional supportive material, and it can allow us to structure the feedback that's most beneficial to students. It can also add in kind of like generic feedback that we've created based on all the feedback we've written. These days, we've had a couple of talks already about the use of AI and those sorts of ideas where you can take your own feedback that you've written and use some form of AI to help summarize your feedback into generic feedback and share that in kind of an inclusive, transparent manner with the students, okay? So like these are things you can actually do once the feedback is written, but the structure of that feedback in terms of the way it's presented is not finalized. The next iteration we're working on can also become progressive in that the feedback sheets can develop across the year for student. So we know which feedback student got in assignment 1. We can start tailoring their feedback sheet for assignment 2, assignment 3, assignment 4 based on the progress we see throughout them. We can start to help them develop more as it goes across the year. Staff have reported having all the feedback in one place highly beneficial. Again, helps develop consistency across the marking, reduces the issues of dealing with multiple software and documents, and it just reduces the cognitive load on the process and allows them to focus on the actual feedback that they're giving. And again, the final really key point of all of this is that feedback and feedforward should be informative to staff as well as students. So we need to incorporate steps that staff are reflecting on their own comments, both immediately after marking and at a later stage to help us develop our own practice. So yeah, just end on there. Thanks very much for your attention. Again, all code will be available, but if you actually do want to try it out, please do drop me an email and I will stop sharing now.